The recording device sat on the table between them, its small red light blinking steadily in the dim room. Krethal adjusted his position on the sitting pad, his thin fingers fumbling with his data tablet. Across from him sat Commander Zokar, and the young journalist could not help but stare at the scars that covered the old soldier's carapace. Where the commander's left primary arm should have been, there was now a mechanical replacement that whirred softly with each movement. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Commander," Krethal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is difficult." Zokar's eyes, clouded with age, fixed on the young Vaxian. "Difficult," he repeated, and something like a bitter laugh escaped him. "You want to know about the war? About the humans. Everyone your age thinks they know what happened, but you weren't there. You didn't see what I saw." The veterans' hall around them was nearly empty. It was late evening on Proxima Tertius, and most of the other old soldiers had gone to their quarters. The walls were covered with images from the war, memorial plaques with names of the fallen and captured weapons mounted in display cases. Among them, Krethal noticed several human rifles, their design brutal and efficient compared to the elegant coalition weapons. "I was just a hatchling when the war ended," Krethal admitted. "The history files say that humanity was a newly discovered species, that the coalition attempted peaceful integration, and they refused. But the files don't explain why the war lasted so long, why it cost so many lives." Zokar reached for a glass of water with his mechanical arm. The movement was precise but lacked the natural grace of organic limbs. "The files," he said slowly, "were written by politicians and historians who never set foot on a battlefield. They don't tell you what it was like." "They can't." Krethal activated his recording device. "Then tell me what really happened." The old commander was silent for a long moment, and Krethal wondered if he had changed his mind. But then Zokar began to speak, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were looking back through the decades to that first encounter. "We found them in the Orion Arm," Zokar said, "a species that had just developed faster than light travel. Primitive, we thought. Their ships were crude, their weapons simple. We had been traveling the stars for over 1,000 years. We had brought 300 species into the Galactic Coalition through peaceful integration. We thought humans would be no different." He paused, his eyes focusing on something Krethal could not see. "The protocol was standard. We sent envoys. We offered them technology, protection, and membership in the greatest alliance the galaxy had ever known. All they had to do was accept coalition law, contribute resources, and allow us to guide their development. Every species had accepted. It was the logical choice. But the humans refused," Krethal prompted. "Not just refused," Zokar corrected. "They told us to leave their space and never return. Their diplomats were polite but firm. They said they would determine their own future. We thought they were being foolish. Young species always think they can stand alone. We believed they would see reason once we demonstrated our strength." The commander's mechanical hand clenched into a fist. "We were so arrogant. We assembled a fleet and headed for one of their colony worlds, a small planet they called New Perth. The plan was simple: blockade the planet, make a show of force, and accept their surrender. It usually took a few days, sometimes a week." Krethal leaned forward, his tablet forgotten. "What happened?" "We arrived in orbit with 50 capital ships. Their colony had maybe a few million inhabitants. We sent the surrender demand and waited." Zokar's voice grew quieter. "They responded by launching every ship they had at us. Cargo vessels, mining ships, personal transports. Everything that could fly they filled with volunteers and sent them straight at our fleet." "Suicide attacks?" Krethal asked, horrified. "We thought so at first. We destroyed them easily, of course. Our weapons were superior. But each ship that died bought time for the colony to prepare. When we finally sent landing forces, we expected the population to surrender. We had destroyed their orbital defenses. They had no hope of victory." Zokar stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Lights twinkled in the darkness, and somewhere in those buildings, humans and aliens lived side by side in peace. It seemed impossible that there had ever been a war. "They didn't surrender," the commander continued. "Every building became a fortress. Every citizen became a soldier. They had no military training, most of them. Farmers, teachers, engineers. It didn't matter. They fought like we were trying to exterminate them, not integrate them." "But you were just following protocol," Krethal said. "Peaceful integration." Jokar turned back to face him. That's what we told ourselves. But we were invading their world, dictating their future. They saw it differently than we did. To them, we were conquerors, and they would rather die than submit. The old soldier returned to his seat, and Krethal could see the weight of memory pressing down on him. It took us 3 months to pacify New Perth, 3 months for one small colony world. We lost 12,000 soldiers. They lost nearly everyone. When it was over, the last human survivors detonated their central power station rather than surrender, took out 500 of our troops in the blast. Krethal felt his blood run cold. They killed themselves? They denied us victory, Zokar said. That's when we should have known. That's when we should have realized what we were dealing with. But the Coalition Council decided the humans of New Perth were an anomaly. Extremists. Surely the rest of humanity would be more reasonable. They weren't, Krethal said. It wasn't a question. Every world was the same. Every battle harder than the last. We won most of the engagements, but each victory cost us more than it should have. The humans learned from every defeat. They adapted their tactics. They studied our weaknesses. Jokar's voice dropped to almost a whisper, and they never ever stopped fighting. The commander looked directly at Krethal, and the young journalist saw something in those old eyes that made him want to look away. It was fear even after all these years. You asked me to tell you about the war, about what made it different. I can sum it up in one sentence. We fought to win battles. Humans fought as if losing meant the end of everything they were. There's no defeating an enemy like that. The red light on the recording device continued to blink, capturing every word. Outside, the peaceful city hummed with life. But in this dim room, Krethal was beginning to understand that the peace he had always known was built on something terrible. Something that still haunted old soldiers like Zokar. This is just the beginning, Zokar said. If you want to understand what happened, you need to hear it all. The tactics they used, the things they did, the things we did. He paused. Are you sure you want to continue? Krethal thought about leaving, about returning to his comfortable life where humans were friends and allies. But he was a journalist. The truth mattered, no matter how uncomfortable. Yes, he said. I need to know. Jokar nodded slowly. Then I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything. Krethal returned the next evening with fresh recording crystals and a determination to hear the full story. Jokar was waiting in the same room, sitting in the same chair as if he had not moved since their last meeting. Perhaps, Krethal thought, this was where the old commander spent most of his time now, alone with his memories. You came back, Jokar observed. You knew I would. The commander made a sound that might have been approval. Then let me tell you about Firebase Kraken. That's where I learned what humans were truly capable of. Jokar's organic hand trembled slightly as he spoke. Firebase Kraken was a human military outpost on the 5th planet in the Tau Ceti system. Not large by military standards. Maybe 5,000 troops. We surrounded it with 3 divisions. Cut off their supply lines. Standard siege protocol. No species can fight without food and ammunition. We settled in to wait for their surrender. How long did Coalition Command expect it to take? Krethal asked. 10 cycles, maybe 15 if they were stubborn. Jokar's eyes grew distant. They held for 47 cycles. The young journalist did the calculation in his head. But that's impossible. Their supplies would have run out after 20 cycles at most. Yes, Jokar said simply. They should have starved. We monitored their communications. We knew their food was gone. We knew their ammunition was nearly depleted. Still, they kept fighting. We couldn't understand it. Krethal waited, knowing there was more. When we finally breached the walls, we found out how they survived. The commander's voice became hollow. They had been eating the dead. Their own dead. They processed the bodies into a nutrient paste that kept them alive. The ones who died in battle became food for the ones still fighting. The recording device captured Krethal's sharp intake of breath. That's barbaric. That's survival, Zokar corrected. We saw it as barbaric because no coalition species would do such a thing. We would surrender first. But humans don't think like us. They have a saying, never surrender, never give up. They meant it literally. The commander stood and walked to one of the display cases on the wall. Inside was a human combat knife, its blade dull with age. This belonged to the last defender of Firebase Kraken, a human female named Lieutenant Chen. When we broke through the final door, she was the only one left alive. She had 17 wounds, should have been dead 3 times over. But she was still standing, still holding this knife. What happened to her? She detonated the base reactor, killed herself and 300 of my soldiers, denied us even the satisfaction of accepting her surrender. Dzhokhar touched the glass case gently. Later, we found her personal log. She wrote in it every day. The last entry said, "They will never take this ground while I breathe." We finally understand why they fight. We have to do the same. Krithal felt sick. You kept the knife as a trophy? As a reminder, Dzhokhar said sharply. A reminder of what we faced. What we underestimated. He returned to his seat. Firebase Kraken was not unique. Every siege was the same. Humans would rather die than quit. But that was just the beginning. Their real genius was in how they fought when they were not trapped behind walls. The old commander's voice took on a different tone now, tinged with something like reluctant admiration. We were trained for conventional warfare, fleet engagements, ground battles with clear lines and objectives, honor in combat. The humans threw all of that away. How so? They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, traps, hit-and-run attacks. They would strike from nowhere, kill as many as they could, and disappear before we could respond. We would secure an area, declare it pacified, and the next day our patrols would vanish, just gone. We would find their bodies days later, sometimes weeks. Dzhokhar's mechanical hand clenched, and the humans would leave messages with the bodies. Warnings, threats. Sometimes they would arrange our dead in patterns that meant something in their culture. Psychological warfare. They wanted us to be afraid, and it worked. Krithal had read about this in the sanitized history files, but hearing it from someone who had been there made it real in a way that data never could. The Coalition had superior technology, superior numbers. How did they manage to be so effective? Because they knew the terrain. Because they were fighting for their homes. Because they were willing to sacrifice everything. Dzhokhar leaned forward. Let me tell you about the medic. The commander's voice became softer, but Krithal could hear the pain in it. We were patrolling near a human settlement. Routine sweep. We came under fire and returned it. When the shooting stopped, we found several human bodies. One was still alive. A medic, judging by the symbols on the uniform. Young. Couldn't have been more than 20 standard years old. We brought the medic back to our field base for interrogation. We needed information about human positions, supply lines, command structure. The Coalition does not torture prisoners, you understand. We use truth serums, neural scanners, painless methods. Krithal nodded, knowing where this was going. The medic had already bitten through the tongue, severed it completely. No tongue, no speech. The neural scanner was useless without verbal responses to calibrate it. The truth serum needed the subject to be able to speak. Dzhokhar's voice cracked slightly. This human had mutilated themselves to prevent giving us information. Chose permanent injury over temporary cooperation. What did you do? We treated the wounds and sent the medic to a prisoner camp. What else could we do? Dzhokhar shook his head. Later, after the war, I learned that humans have a code for prisoners. Name, rank, and identification number. Nothing more. This medic could not even tell us that much, but found a way to follow the code anyway. The old soldier was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. We started to realize that we were not fighting a conventional enemy. These humans had spent their entire history fighting each other. They had refined warfare into an art form. Every dirty trick, every psychological tactic, every way to maximize damage while minimizing risk. They knew it all because they had used it all on each other. The Coalition Council still believed we would win. Dzhokhar continued. We had better ships, better weapons, better everything. But wars are not won by technology alone. They are won by will. And the humans had a will we could not break. Krithal looked at his notes, at the stories of Firebase Kraken and the medic and the guerrilla warfare. How did your soldiers handle it? The constant fear, the uncertainty? Some handled it well. Others did not. Dzhokhar's expression darkened. Some of our soldiers started refusing patrol duty. Some deserted. Some took out their fear on human prisoners in ways I will not describe. War brings out the worst in all species, journalist. Not just humans. The admission hung in the air between them. Krithal had always thought of the Coalition as the civilized party in the war, but he was starting to see that the distinction was not so clear. The battles got worse, Dzhokhar said. The humans learned and adapted faster than we could counter. Every tactic we developed, they found a way around it. Every advantage we had, they found a way to neutralize. It was like fighting smoke. You could never quite grasp it, never quite pin it down. The commander looked directly at Krethal. You wanted to know about the war. This is what it was like. Constant fear. Constant death. Fighting an enemy that refused to acknowledge they were beaten, even when all logic said they should surrender. We were fighting humans, journalist, and that was something the Coalition had never encountered before. The third evening, Krethal arrived to find Dzhokhar already speaking into his own recording device. The old commander looked up as the journalist entered, then gestured to the empty seat. I have been thinking about our conversations, Dzhokhar said, remembering things I had tried to forget. Sit. There is more you need to hear. Krethal settled into his usual position and activated his equipment. I'm ready. Today I will tell you about how the war changed, Dzhokhar began. About when we stopped advancing and started worrying about survival. It happened slowly, then all at once. The turning point was human adaptability. The commander pulled up a holographic display showing ship schematics. This is a Coalition fighter craft from the beginning of the war. Advanced propulsion, energy shields, plasma weapons. We had a technological advantage of at least 1,000 years. This should have been an insurmountable gap. He manipulated the display, bringing up another schematic. This is a human fighter from 6 months into the war. Look closely, Krethal studied the image. The design was different, cruder in some ways, but several components looked disturbingly familiar. They copied your technology, not just copied, improved. Dzhokhar highlighted several sections. Here they modified the shield generators to be more efficient. Here they redesigned the power distribution system to reduce energy loss. Here they added redundant systems we never thought necessary. When one of our ships took critical damage, it was disabled. When one of their ships took the same damage, it kept fighting. How is that possible? Krethal asked. You said they were primitive. They were, Dzhokhar agreed. But they learned faster than any species we had ever encountered. Every ship of ours they captured, they took apart and studied. Every battle gave them data. Every defeat taught them lessons. Within a year, they had closed gaps that should have taken decades. Within 2 years, they were matching us in space combat. Within 3 years, they were beating us. The old soldier dismissed the holograms. Intelligence reported that human scientists were working in shifts around the clock. They had mobilized their entire industrial capacity for war production. Every resource, every mind, every factory. Totalva. The Coalition had never seen anything like it because we had never needed anything like it. Dzhokhar stood and walked to the window. The city lights reflected in his eyes. Then came Mars. That was when we knew we were in real trouble. The Coalition had occupied Mars, Krethal said, recalling his research. Humanity's first colony world in their own solar system. Yes, we took it early in the war, used it as a staging ground for operations against Earth. It was heavily fortified. 10,000 troops, orbital defense platforms, and a fleet in permanent orbit. Impregnable, we thought. Dzhokhar's voice grew quiet. The humans took it back in 3 days. Krethal felt his throat tighten. How? They launched every ship they had. Warships, cargo vessels, even ships they built specifically for this one mission. Ships with no return capability, designed only to reach Mars and deliver their payload. The pilots knew it was a one-way trip. They volunteered anyway. The commander turned back to face Krethal. We destroyed 70% of their fleet before they reached Mars orbit. 70%. But the 30% that got through was enough. They dropped troops who fought like demons. They had studied our defensive positions for months. They knew exactly where to strike. The battle for Mars lasted 72 hours, Dzhokhar continued. We lost 8,000 troops. They lost over 20,000, but they won. They took back Mars because they were willing to pay a price we could not comprehend. A 70% casualty rate would have broken any coalition force. The humans called it acceptable losses. Krethal struggled to process this. Why would they throw away so many lives? Because Mars was their home. Because every victory, no matter how costly, proved they could win. Because they needed to believe they could beat us, and Mars proved they could. Dzhokhar returned to his seat heavily. After Mars, everything changed. Coalition Command began to worry. We had been in the war for 3 years. We had won more battles than we lost. But we were not winning the war. The old soldier pulled up another display, this one showing casualty figures. Look at these numbers. Coalition losses were sustainable but steady. We were losing ships, troops, and equipment faster than we could replace them. Our member species were growing tired of a war that seemed to have no end. Meanwhile, human casualties were catastrophic, but they kept fighting. They never wavered. I saw wounded humans continue fighting with injuries that would kill most species, Zokar said softly. I saw them carry their wounded off the battlefield when retreat would have been easier. I saw them refuse medical evacuation because they did not want to leave their units. They had a concept called esprit de corps, unit cohesion so strong they would rather die with their comrades than survive without them. Krethal made notes, his hands shaking slightly. What else did they do? Psychological warfare, Zokar said. They learned our languages faster than our translators expected. They studied our cultures, our beliefs, our fears. Then they used that knowledge against us. They began broadcasting propaganda into coalition space, not crude threats, but sophisticated messages designed to create doubt. They told the truth about battles we had lost. They showed footage of coalition prisoners being treated well, contradicting our own propaganda. They drove wedges between coalition species by highlighting inequalities in how the war was being prosecuted. The commander's expression grew darker. Some of it worked. We had 37 member species in the coalition. The humans found ways to make 15 of them question whether the war was worth fighting. They exploited old tensions between species. They suggested that some coalition members were bearing more of the burden than others. It was masterful manipulation. They also, Zokar paused, choosing his words carefully, they intercepted our communications. We thought our encryption was unbreakable. They broke it. They began feeding us false intelligence, troop movements that did not exist, supply convoys that were traps. We had to assume all our communications were compromised. The fog of war became absolute. Krethal looked up from his notes. It sounds like they were winning. They were not winning, Zokar corrected. Neither side was winning, but they were making sure we could not win either. Stalemate was a victory for them because it meant survival. For us, stalemate was defeat because we had committed to quick integration. The old soldier's voice dropped to a whisper. That was when Coalition Command began discussing other options. Terrible options. There were proposals to use biological weapons, to bombard Earth from orbit until nothing lived, to make examples of human colony worlds to break their will. Did you? Krethal asked, horrified. We considered it. Some admirals advocated for it strongly. But intelligence suggested the humans had anticipated this possibility. They had somehow acquired or built weapons of mass destruction and positioned them throughout coalition space. Deadman switches, they called them. If humanity fell, the coalition would burn with them. Zokar met Krethal's eyes. We could not verify if this was true or an elaborate bluff, but we could not risk calling that bluff. So we did not use the terrible weapons, and the war continued. By year 4, both sides were exhausted, but humans never showed it. They kept attacking, kept adapting, kept learning. Every mistake we made, they exploited. Every new tactic we tried, they countered within weeks. The commander's voice was filled with reluctant respect. We had fought wars against dozens of species. We had never encountered an enemy like this, one that refused to be beaten no matter how many times they lost. One that learned from every defeat and came back stronger. The coalition is a union of civilized species, Zokar said. We believed in honor, in proportionate response, in the rules of war. Humans knew all those rules and broke them when it suited their purposes, not because they were evil, but because they understood something we did not. Rules only matter when both sides follow them. And they were fighting for survival. Krethal saved his notes and looked at the old commander. If neither side could win, how did the war end? That, Zokar said, is a story for tomorrow. But I will tell you this. The war ended not because we defeated humanity, but because we realized we could not, and that realization came at a terrible cost. Krethal almost did not come back for the 4th evening. He had spent the previous night unable to sleep, his mind filled with images of the war Zokar described, but his commitment to the truth drove him back to the Veterans Hall. When he arrived, he found Zokar staring at a memorial wall covered with names. Do you know how many coalition soldiers died in the war? The commander asked without turning around. The official number is 372,000, Krethal answered. 372,416, Zokar corrected. I know because I helped compile the list. Every name on this wall I knew personally or knew someone who knew them. The unofficial number, including support personnel and civilians caught in the fighting, is closer to 1 million. He finally turned to face the journalist. Do you know how many humans died? Krethal shook his head. 43 million. 43 million humans died in a war that lasted 6 years. Military and civilian combined. Their worlds burned. Their colonies were destroyed. They lost more people than most species have in total population. Jokar's voice was hollow. And they never surrendered. They never even came close. The two sat down in their usual positions. Krethal noticed that Jokar looked older tonight, more worn. Whatever story he was about to tell, it was costing him to remember it. Today I will tell you about the worst things, the commander said quietly. The things we do not speak of. The things that haunt me still. Today I will tell you what total war really means. Jothal took a long drink of water before continuing. Year 5 of the war. We were advancing on 3 core human worlds, important manufacturing centers. If we could take them, we could cripple human war production. It should have been our greatest victory. What happened? The humans evacuated the populations. All civilians, all non-essential personnel. We thought they were retreating, abandoning the worlds to save lives. We were wrong. Jokar's hands trembled. They contaminated their own planets. Biological weapons. Nuclear warheads detonated at strategic locations. Nanotech plagues that would persist for centuries. They made those worlds completely uninhabitable. Krethal felt sick. They destroyed their own worlds? Scorched Earth, they called it. An old human military doctrine. If you cannot hold territory, make sure the enemy cannot use it either. 3 entire worlds, journalist. Billions of years of evolution, countless ecosystems all rendered lifeless. The message was clear. If they could not have those worlds, we could not have them either. But the industrial capacity, Krethal protested. They needed those facilities. They had already moved the critical equipment off-world. The factories we found were empty shells. Everything valuable was gone. We captured 3 strategically important worlds and gained nothing. Nothing except the knowledge that humans would destroy anything rather than let us take it. Jokar stood and paced the room. That was not the worst thing. The worst thing happened at New Harmony. The commander's voice became strained. New Harmony was a colony world with 2 million inhabitants. We began orbital bombardment as part of our advance. Standard procedure, weaken defenses, then demand surrender. The human government ordered evacuation. Ships began lifting off with civilians. But some stayed behind. Krethal said. Yes. Young humans. Adolescents by their standards. Children by ours. Jokar stopped pacing, his back to the journalist. They volunteered to remain behind and conduct delaying actions, to buy time for the evacuation. We did not know this at first. We thought we were fighting regular military. When we finally captured some of them, we realized they were just children, 15, 16, 17 standard years old, barely old enough to understand what death means. But they had been trained, armed, and sent to die so others could escape. Krethal heard the pain in Jokar's voice. What did you do? What could we do? They were enemy combatants. They had killed coalition soldiers. The rules of war say that anyone who takes up arms is a legitimate target, regardless of age. The commander finally turned around, and Krethal saw tears on his face. But they were children, journalist. Children who should have been in schools, not fighting a war. Some commanders sent the captured ones to prisoner camps. Some executed them as spies because they were not in proper military uniforms. Some, like me, did not know what to do, so we did nothing. We let our subordinates make the choice. Jokar's voice broke. I have lived with that cowardice for 50 years. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the recording device. Krethal did not know what to say. There were no words adequate for this. The humans called it the Children's Crusade, Jokar continued, wiping his eyes. They made heroes of those young ones, built monuments to them. But I remember their faces when we captured them. They were terrified. They were children pretending to be soldiers, and they died by the thousands. What kind of species sends their children to die? A desperate one, Krethal said softly. Yes, and we made them desperate. Jokar sat back down. There is more. Worse things. Do you want me to continue? Krethal nodded, though part of him wanted to run from this room and never return. The humans weaponized disease, Zokar said flatly. They identified pathogens from their own world that were harmless to them, but lethal to Coalition biology. Then they modified those pathogens to be more infectious, more deadly. They created plague weapons. They infected volunteers, humans who knowingly carried death in their bodies. Then they sent these people into Coalition space disguised as refugees or defectors. By the time we realized what was happening, 3 Coalition worlds had been infected. Billions died before we developed countermeasures. Krethal's voice was barely a whisper. That's biological warfare. That's a war crime. Yes, Zokar agreed. And we committed our own. Do you want to hear about them? The journalist realized he was crying. He nodded anyway. We bombarded civilian targets when we thought military assets were present. We executed prisoners when we suspected they had intelligence. We used chemical weapons in populated areas. We destroyed human cultural sites to break their morale. We did terrible things, journalist, because war makes monsters of us all. Zokar's mechanical hand clenched into a fist. I personally gave the order to execute 47 human prisoners. They were wounded, captured after a battle. Intelligence said a human rescue team was coming for them. I decided they were too valuable to let them be rescued, too dangerous to keep. So I had them executed. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself it was within the rules of war. I told myself many things to help me sleep. The old commander looked directly at Krethal. But I know what I did. I murdered 47 beings who had surrendered, who were under my protection. That is the truth I have lived with. The weight of this confession hung in the air. Krethal understood now why veterans did not speak of the war. The truth was too heavy to share. Both sides committed atrocities, Zokar said. Both sides did things we are ashamed of. The difference is that the humans admit it. They teach their children about the things they did, the mistakes they made. They remember so they do not forget the cost of war. We in the Coalition prefer to forget. We prefer to believe we were the civilized ones, fighting a barbaric enemy. But I was there. I know better. In war, civilization is the first casualty. Honor, mercy, compassion, all of them die when survival is at stake. Zokar stood slowly, looking exhausted. That is enough for tonight. Tomorrow I will tell you how the war ended. But remember what you have heard today. Remember that heroes and monsters are often the same people, wearing different masks depending on who tells the story. Krethal gathered his equipment with shaking hands. As he left, he looked back at Zokar, who had returned to staring at the memorial wall. The old soldier seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of memory. Outside, the city was peaceful. Humans and aliens walked together, talked together, lived together. But Krethal saw it differently now. He saw the cost of that peace, paid in blood and horror by an entire generation. And he wondered if anyone truly won that war, or if everyone just lost in different ways. On the 5th evening, Krethal arrived to find the interview room different. Zokar had arranged 2 chairs facing each other without the table between them. There was no recording device visible. The old commander looked up as the journalist entered. Sit, Zokar said. This final conversation is different. You can record it if you wish, but what I tell you tonight is not just history. It is a warning. Krethal activated his personal recorder and sat down. I'm here to listen. Then I will tell you how the war ended, Zokar began. And more importantly, what it means for your generation. The commander settled back in his chair, his mechanical arm resting on his lap. Year 6 of the war. Both sides were exhausted. The Coalition had lost nearly 400,000 soldiers and spent resources that would take decades to replace. Humanity had lost 43 million people and seen a dozen worlds destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Any rational analysis said both sides needed peace. But humans are not always rational, Krethal observed. Neither are we, Zokar countered. Pride and fear kept the war going long after logic said it should end. Coalition command believed one more push could break human resistance. Human leadership believed one more victory could force us to negotiate. Both were wrong. The old soldier's eyes grew distant. The turning point came not from a battle but from a realization. Our intelligence division finally decoded enough human communications to understand their strategic doctrine. What they learned terrified the High Council. What did they find? That humanity was prepared to fight for another 100 years if necessary. That they had decentralized their government and military, so no single strike could destroy their capability to wage war. That they had hidden resources throughout their space that we could not locate. That they had contingency plans built on contingency plans. Jokar leaned forward. But most importantly, they discovered the Omega Protocols. I have heard that term, Krethal said. But the histories do not explain what it means, because the Coalition does not want people to know how close we came to mutual annihilation. The commander's voice was grave. The Omega Protocols were humanity's final insurance policy. They had placed weapons throughout Coalition space, not just in our territory but in our home systems, weapons that would activate automatically if certain conditions were met. If Earth fell, those weapons would destroy the Coalition capital worlds. If the human leadership was killed, those weapons would activate. If humanity surrendered, those weapons would activate. The message was clear. We will take you with us into darkness. Krethal felt cold. They were holding the entire Coalition hostage. Yes, and we had no way to find all the weapons. We had no way to disarm them. We had no way to call their bluff because it was not a bluff. Jokar's voice carried a mix of horror and admiration. Humans had learned from their own history. They knew that an enemy with nothing to lose is the most dangerous enemy. So they made sure we always had something to lose. That is when the Coalition High Council finally accepted what field commanders like me had known for years. We could not win this war. The best we could hope for was survival. The commander stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. The armistice negotiations took 8 months. Both sides were suspicious. Both sides tried to gain advantage. But eventually we reached an agreement. Humanity would be recognized as an independent sovereign power. We would withdraw from all human territories. They would deactivate the Omega Protocols, though we suspect some remain hidden even now. The war ended not with victory or defeat, Jokar said quietly, but with exhausted acceptance. We stopped fighting because we were terrified of what would happen if we continued. Krethal made notes, then looked up. But that was 50 years ago. Now humans are our allies. We trade with them. We cooperate on scientific projects. Some humans even serve in coalition military forces. How did we go from enemies to friends? Did we? Jokar turned back from the window. Or did we simply stop being enemies? The old soldier returned to his chair. After the armistice, I spent years studying humanity. I needed to understand what we had fought, what we had failed to defeat. I learned things that your generation does not know or has chosen to forget. Tell me, Krethal said. Humans have been fighting each other for their entire history. Their legends, their myths, their culture, all of it is built on stories of conflict. They have fought over territory, resources, beliefs, ideologies. They have perfected warfare in ways we cannot imagine because they have practiced it on each other for thousands of years. Jokar's voice grew intense. Every tactic they used against us, they had used against each other first. The guerrilla warfare, the psychological operations, the total war doctrine, all of it refined through centuries of human against human conflict. When they fought us, they were not inventing new methods. They were applying lessons learned from fighting themselves. That is terrifying, Krethal said. That is just the beginning. The commander counted points on his fingers. Humans have a concept called martyrdom. Dying for a cause is seen as honorable. They have stories about individuals who sacrificed everything for their beliefs and are celebrated as heroes. No coalition species thinks this way. We value survival and compromise. Humans value conviction and sacrifice. They have another concept called total war. The idea that in existential conflict, all resources and all people become part of the war effort. Civilian and military become meaningless distinctions. Everyone fights, everyone contributes, or everyone dies. The coalition has never fought a total war. We make war while maintaining our civilian life. Humans erase the distinction entirely. They have sayings that reveal their thinking. Never give up, never surrender. Death before dishonor. Live free or die. These are not just words. They mean them, literally. Jokar's voice filled with passion. Do you understand what we encountered? A species where dying for principle is considered noble, where surrender is considered worse than death, where the collective will is strong enough to override individual survival instinct. Krethal felt overwhelmed. Then why did they agree to peace? If they think this way, why did they not fight to extinction? Because, Jokar said softly, they are also capable of extreme pragmatism. They knew the war was destroying them. They knew victory was impossible, so they made the strategic choice to accept peace, not because they lost their will to fight, but because they chose a different path to survival. That capacity to switch from total war to pragmatic peace, that ability to make cold logical choices even when consumed by rage and grief, that is what makes them truly dangerous. They can be both the most savage warriors and the most rational negotiators. They can do whatever is necessary to survive. The old commander's voice dropped. Your generation sees humans as friends, as equals in the coalition. You trade with them, work with them, even marry them. You think the war is ancient history. But I was there. I remember what they are capable of. Are you saying we should fear them? Krithal asked. I am saying we should respect them, understand them, never take them for granted. Jokar met the journalist's eyes. Humans chose to be our allies. They chose to forgive what we did to them. They chose to help rebuild the coalition after the war nearly bankrupted us. They chose peace, but choice goes both ways. They could choose differently. And if they ever decide we are their enemies again, we will not survive. We barely survived the first time when they were primitive and unprepared. Now they have our technology. Now they have experience. Now they have a place in galactic affairs. The commander stood one final time. Do you know what the most frightening thing about humans is? It is not their capacity for violence. It is not their refusal to surrender. It is not even their clever tactics or their ability to learn. What is it? Krithal asked. It is that when the war ended, they forgave us. Jokar's voice was filled with wonder and fear. We invaded their space. We killed 43 million of them. We destroyed their worlds. We treated them as primitives who needed to be civilized. And when it was over, when they had every reason to hate us forever, they chose forgiveness, that level of emotional control, that capacity to set aside rage and grief for pragmatic cooperation, that ability to make peace with an enemy who wronged them so deeply. That is what makes them truly formidable. Because it shows they can do anything they decide to do. They can be savage or civilized, brutal or merciful, based purely on what serves their interests. Jokar walked to the memorial wall one last time. The young humans I see in the city now, your generation who never knew the war, they are polite, friendly, cooperative. They work alongside coalition citizens as equals. But their grandparents fought us to a standstill. Their parents rebuilt a civilization from ashes. That strength, that resilience, that capacity for anything, it is still there in their genes, in their culture, in their history. The old soldier turned back to Krithal. So when you publish your interview, when you tell people what I have told you, make sure they understand this. Humans are not our friends because they are weak. They are our friends because they are strong enough to choose friendship. That choice can be unmade. You think there could be another war? Krithal asked, his voice shaking.